Greetings, my name is Jay Johnson, CEO of Coeus Creative Group. I'm incredibly excited to talk to you today about leadership in a crisis, particularly about managing behaviors. As a leader, one of the most important things that we can do is manage our behavior in a crisis. But before I go into that, I want to say thank you to JCI Finland for all of the work in putting this amazing program together. So without further ado, let's talk about behavioral intelligence. That's what my company specializes in, and behavioral intelligence is easily explained as the skills and abilities to accurately explain existing behaviors, predict future behaviors, influence other people's behaviors, and control our own behaviors. In this type of environment of a crisis, a global pandemic, we need to be able to explain exactly how our followers are understanding the environment and how they're operating within that environment. We need to be able to think about the future prospects and stakeholders and be able to predict how they're going to behave. Once we can do that as a leader, we have the ability to influence other people's behaviors, but then also control our own. So let's start by defining what a crisis is. A crisis is a perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds a person's current capacity, resources, or coping mechanisms. This definition comes from James and Gilliland in 2001, and I really like the definition because I think it very adequately displays that a crisis can be both a global pandemic, such as what we're experiencing, but it can also be the perception of crisis. It doesn't necessarily have to be an event. So for example, we as individuals might have a personal crisis. That could be a moral crisis or a crisis of conscience. We could also be experiencing external events that create crisis for us, such as the 2008 global economic crisis. Whatever it is, we as leaders need to be prepared and function in this time of high anxiety and frustration. And that's one of the most important things that we're going to look at today in this talk. The first thing that we need to understand is how people react and how they understand crisis. So in the moment of crisis, we know that our anxiety goes up, particularly in a prolonged crisis. If it's a short-term thing, anxiety and stress is actually not a bad thing. Anxiety and stress tell us that we are at a point in time where we need to take action to change something. It's our prompt, it's our motivation in some cases. Our stress and anxiety come from the limbic system of the brain. So that's the fight, flight, or faint response that all of us have, and it's a survivalist mechanism. But when we're in a crisis, particularly a prolonged one, those feelings and those reactions can truly intensify. The longer that goes, the more cortisol, the more adrenaline, the more norepinephrine is being pumped into our systems. Now, the challenge for us as a leader is that cortisol is devastating to the way that we think, the way that we make decisions, the way that we react, and the way that we communicate. When we are not necessarily prepared for that intolerable difficulty, as was described in that definition, one of the things that we do is we hastily make decisions, or we might not necessarily rationally think all things through. But today's talk is going to give you the tools that are necessary to empower you to be that next level leader that we're all striving to be in this environment. So let's talk first about the mental states of people inside of a crisis. One of the things that ends up happening is we panic. Part of the reason is the uncertainty that a crisis brings. When we don't know what the way out is, the solution, or even when a crisis is going to end, one of those things is our brain starts to naturally fill in those gaps. And when we're filling in those gaps, it's never with something positive. So just think of a time that a friend called you and said, hey, we need to talk. You probably didn't immediately assume that it was going to be a positive talk. You might be thinking, well, what is it? How could, what is something? Did I upset them? Did I frustrate them? And then when you have that talk and it's completely unrelated, you feel that relief. Well, that's our brain protecting itself. That's that survivalist limbic system. We're proposed with something, but that uncertainty creates that element of panic. Leaders that panic in crisis tend to make more mistakes, and they also don't necessarily function in the way that we want to function. But this is also true of followers. So in the moment that a crisis occurs on an organizational level or on a cultural level, one of the things that followers will start to do is fill in the gaps with the unknowns. And that has an effect on the way that we process information, the way we behave, and the way that we function within that organization. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that follower mentality in this panicked state of crisis. A couple of different things that we're going to notice is the way that people process information. And one of the things that they do is they simplify the communication that comes out. So even think back to a few weeks ago or a month ago when we just started hearing more news of this coronavirus or COVID-19 and the kind of impact that it could create on our society. One of the early messages that we started to hear is, don't worry about it. It's just like the flu, and it has flu-like symptoms. But as of today, we know that the science has shown us that the mortality rates on something like COVID and its ability to spread is far greater and far more lethal than something like the flu, which is why we find ourselves in this situation currently. With that being said, we try to simplify down the messages to something that we understand. The brain does this naturally, and the reason that it does that is because it does not like uncertainty. If we don't know something, we try to fill in the gaps with it. So simplifying it down to something that's understandable and manageable is a way for us to actually relieve some of that anxiety and stress that comes from a crisis. Another way that we do this is once we have some notion of what's going on, we seek out more information. Now, that sounds like a great thing, but the problem with that is in a crisis, we often seek out the information that reaffirms or confirms what we already believe. And that's called the confirmation bias. When we have a confirmation bias, we're going to look to channels specifically that are going to reaffirm and support our already existing beliefs. And that's kind of the third element here, is that we really hold on to those beliefs because we don't like all of the change at once. When we start to see the crisis and everything starting to emerge, we hold on to those existing beliefs and we lock ourselves in. That can be a huge detriment to any leader if the followers have already latched onto a specific ideology or a specific concept. And it's even true if the leader does the same. Now, the final thing is people often believe the very first messaging that they hear, which is why it's critically important as a leader to be able to manage those first messages and to get those first messages out quickly, so that way the followers have something that reduces some of that uncertainty. And the reason that we want to do that is if we don't reduce that uncertainty, their brain is going to automatically do that with the worst case scenarios. And that's something that we're going to try to avoid. So let's look at a process. How can we as leaders be better in this crisis scenario? Whether the crisis is occurring, whether it's a future crisis that you're going to be managing. Here are some best practices from a leadership perspective to make sure that you're staying on top and that you're giving the best possible leadership to the people that are following you. We need to think about leadership in two different capacities. One is, and our natural proclivity in many cases, is that when a crisis occurs, our behaviors turn to sort of three different elements. They turn to avoidance. And this is the case where we start to say, let's just not deal with this just yet. Let's try to figure something out. We're going to get more information before we do anything about this. That is an element of a defense mechanism. Now, it's critical to not mistake this with a positive of analyzing and looking at data and things like that. That's definitely important, but that's going to come a little bit later. This is the initial response. So that avoidance as an initial response is generally problematic. It allows people that time to assess and bring their own ideas into what they think is happening and filling in those uncertainty gaps, which are going to be problematic in the long run. The second element of that is passivity. This is where they take an approach to say, we're just not going to do anything about this right now because it'll probably fix itself. In many cases, that's a huge impact on how quickly you can get out of the crisis or how quickly you can manage that crisis. And that's something that we're seeing even today. The third element is denial. The denial of the problem existing or anything is actually in crisis. That can be a huge detriment because it fails to allow us to act or take a motivated approach to strategically thinking about how can we manage this situation in a more effective leadership capacity. The second type of leader in that crisis is the more engagement focused, and this is the leader that we want to be. They're the ones that are going to actively engage in whatever that crisis is. That's going to include communicating, that's going to include thinking about it, that's going to include creating some kind of plan. This type of leader is also much more decisive. They're willing to make those decisions early on. with little or limited information as they possibly have. But at the same time, they're agile and adaptive enough that they can go back and reassess their plan. Just like any organization that does strategic planning will tell you, the strategic plan for an organization evolves over time. As more information or as more goals are brought to that organization, they're going to reassess and they're going to look at it and they're going to make decisions based on that day. That's the type of leader that we need to look at inside of a crisis. The ones that are able to make a decisive decision and stick by it, but be willing to be agile and adaptable. Sometimes those decisions are going to be wrong. And that's one of the huge impacts that cause us to not make the decisions, is the fear of missing out or the fear of being wrong in the face of adversity. We as leaders kind of tend to protect ourselves from that. But in a crisis, it's critical to have some of that decisive decision making. We're going to give you tools to be able to do that more effectively. The final element of this type of leader in a crisis is action-oriented. They're going to be looking for ways in order to mitigate the crisis or mitigate the effects of crisis. They're going to look for innovative solutions. They're going to be trying to do whatever they can to get through that momentary crisis in order to emerge on the other side of it much more effective. So these are the tools that that type of leader is going to engage in. First, we're going to talk about this entire concept of managing crisis from that personal side of things. Like, what does the leader do first in this crisis? Number one, don't panic, okay? It's very easy to hit the panic button, especially when this information comes into us. Our natural response, again, that limbic system is very fast, and it's going to say, oh gosh, what are we going to do? How are we going to manage this? You might feel your heart race. You could feel your palms sweat. It's no different than your body's reaction to standing on a stage, actually. This is the most interesting thing, is that we can actually calm that down with a very simple technique, and that's taking a deep breath, or a series of them. So in that moment where we feel that intensity, that anxiety, taking a step back and breathing introduces more oxygen into the system. Practicing that element of breathing can actually reduce our limbic reaction and reduce the amount of cortisol that's being dumped into our brains and our bodies. That's critically important. If we can reduce that impact, it allows us to think clearer, make better choices, and also to take more action. It stops that paralyzation of us from the fear. So we want to make sure that we're going to take a step back, not hit the panic button, and take a deep breath. We're going to think through this rationally. First things first, we need to get out a preliminary message to our people, to our stakeholders, and to our clients. That's one of the most critical things that leaders can do to help reduce or manage some of that uncertainty. We may not have all the facts. We may not know everything that's going on. We may not even know what the solution is or the scope of the crisis at this point in time. We should still be putting out some level of preliminary message that says, hey, I'm aware of this. This is happening. These are the steps that I'm taking at this moment to try to get my hands around this, and I will be in communication with you soon with more information. Something so simple, but that first initial message is something that tells people, hey, our leader's on top of this, they're managing it. And if you can even give a date to say, I plan to give you an update by tomorrow at noon, that is something that also helps to reduce the uncertainty of those followers. They know that someone is doing something about it, and that's really an element of psychological safety that you can provide as a leader. It reduces just a small amount of that uncertainty for this situation. Communicating that quickly and getting that out is very critical for a leadership. Also, gathering information. So once we get that message out there that, hey, we're working on this, this is that time to truly be gathering as much information as possible. Now, I'm going to give you a caveat here. Be very mindful of where you're gathering your information from. We as human beings have a tendency to get into the echo chamber, where we're only reviewing one source or we're only looking at a specific set. That's another set of biases that we end up finding more often inside of a crisis. So as you're gathering information, make sure that you're looking at multiple different outlets, multiple different pieces of news. You're surveying multiple people to really try to get a better grasp holistically on all of these different elements that are occurring within your crisis. So for example, during the COVID time, one of my mainstay sources of information has been Johns Hopkins University. I've gone to a source that is essentially feeding a lot of the information for the World Health Organization or for the CDC. That seems like a very credible source. But in addition to that, I am also reading all the different media outlets and making sure that I'm trying to create a balanced approach. We know that the media can get political sometimes. We know that there is people that are going to spread misinformation. Being able to get multiple different viewpoints as a leader is going to give you the best access to decision making as that information synthesizes. One of the easy steps that you can do as a leader that most people actually forget in a crisis situation is to consult your governing documents. Your governing documents, whether it's your bylaws, whether it's your corporate policies or anything else, should usually give some level of guidance in these types of situations. Now, with an understanding that maybe they didn't predict that we were going to have a global pandemic on our hands, or it's not going to be able to predict every single crisis that comes your way, one of the things that you can do with your governing documents is to look for different areas that maybe give guidance to smaller portions of this. So for example, we as a company didn't necessarily prepare for a global pandemic. However, since we were aware of the global economic crisis and lived through that in 2008, our company had an economic downturn policy and a crisis plan in case that came into play. And guess what? That was really useful because that was something that helped us to determine our next courses of action. So even though it wasn't a global crisis plan for the situation that we were using, our governing documents did help set up a framework for us to manage certain elements of that. Consult those documents. It's going to tell you what you can and can't do. It's going to tell you how to behave in many cases, and it can be a really big value because it's going to guide some of that different transparency that you're looking at, that your followers are going to demand and request of you as you move forward. If you have a plan, follow it. By all means, introduce that plan. Be flexible, be agile, be willing to change it as new information comes in, but start the process of executing that plan. And if you don't have a plan, this is where you're going to want to build one. You're going to want to look at a little bit out, not just the day of or the next day or anything else, but you're going to want to start thinking ahead and planning ahead. At some point in time, that crisis plan, even if it's exhaustive, is going to come to a close and the crisis will hopefully come to an end. And in the event that it does, you want to make sure that you've got some kind of trackable documentation of how you as a leader manage through that crisis so you can have learning opportunities in case another crisis occurs, but also that shows that you were planning ahead and that you have solutions for the light at the end of the tunnel. When we think about it from leadership, one of the things that we have to do really early on is accept what we cannot control. There are different elements that are going out right now that are completely out of any of our control, and that's okay, because that allows us, if we accept that and we know I can't determine how quickly the government decides to close things down. I can't determine how quickly supporting finances are coming into businesses or organizations. That's not something I can control. However, that gives me clarity of focus of the things that I can control. And that's critical. When we're in that crisis, we're not going to be able to manage everything. So we have to strategically think through and put our energy where it's most useful. Accepting what we can and can't control is the first step in us being able to really hone in on the critical pieces that are going to make a substantial difference in the way that we manage through the crisis. Something that hopefully is set up within your crisis plan or within your documents is establishing some sort of framework for how you're going to respond. Now, this could include things like identifying a key point person for external communications or internal communications. This could also identify somebody that's going to handle only media relations. This could also be the structure of how decisions are made, whether there's task forces or committees, or whether there's one person that you're going to empower with the ability, or you as the leader are the one person empowered with the ability to make the final calls and decisions that need to be made. Yes, that can be very daunting, but ideally you've got some kind of structure that's currently set up this way. When you establish those clear lines of chain of command, and you also start to establish those clear policies, this is again going to give some level of normalcy and security. It's going to give an idea and a transparency for how this situation is being handled and managed, and who's ultimately the person who's making those decisions. A true amazing opportunity for you as a leader is to establish decision calculuses. When we're in crisis, one of the things that cortisol gets into that prefrontal cortex, and we're not thinking as clearly or efficiently as we normally do. Which is why when we think about decisions and how we make decisions, we need to think about it almost in terms of motivation. So some days I might be motivated to make dinner at home, and some days I might not be motivated to make dinner, and I'm just going to stop and grab something on the way. It's those moments where we have high motivation that we could actually be putting in different plans that make it easier for us. So for example, I might have high motivation on Sunday, so I prepare a couple of different meals that all I have to do is pop into the oven. Now, when I get to Tuesday and I'm exhausted and I don't have that, I can just take that and throw it in there. That pre-planning decision calculus works in the exact same way. You look at decision calculuses and say a couple of things that we can use as thresholds. So for example, a date. If you have a specific date that you know there are consequences to not making a decision, establish that as part of your decision calculus. So this year I'm representing JCI USA as the Deputy National President, and one of the things that we had planned was a year-end cruise. There was a particular day that we knew that if we didn't make a decision on whether to cancel or to continue forward, it would have financial consequences to the organization. At that point in time, that day became our decision calculus. We knew that we didn't have to argue about when to make that decision. We knew that decision had to be made by that point in time. That takes a lot of burden off of you as a leader. Other ways to establish decision calculuses is certain triggers that might happen. If we lose this much revenue, this is the plan that we'll take. If we have X amount of clients say this is how we're going to focus our future efforts. Making those decisions when you're in a good place or you have that high motivation is something that will help you in those moments where you're really struggling or feeling the anxiety of crisis. Now that you've gotten through some of those major elements of decision making from the leadership side of things, we need to think about how are we going to communicate. One of the things that we need to consider is authentic communication that is empathetic to our leadership's concerns, but also transparent. We want to make sure that we're communicating enough information to reduce some of that uncertainty. This is where we're going to establish the protocols and communicate those out to our followers, to our clients, to our stakeholders, and to the public at large. This is how we're operating, this is what we're thinking, this is what we're doing. Establishing a communication protocol of we're going to communicate this out every Tuesday, an update, and maybe one on Friday as well, that's something that grants certainty. So if you can establish those things and then start communicating to that aspect, it's going to be hugely valuable in reducing that uncertainty. If we don't manage the uncertainty, they're going to manage it internally up here, and it's going to go towards that worst case scenario. And we don't want to create more panic than's already necessary inside of that crisis. We also want to practice empathy in terms of that communication. We really need to think through how are our people experiencing this? What are they worried about? We can do this in a lot of different ways, whether that's interviews or whether that is surveys. We can walk a mile in their shoes, essentially, but that's something that we need to think about. So me as the leader, I might be very concerned with the overall health of the organization, but if I'm looking at, say, an employee or a follower, what is it that they're thinking about? Are they worried about their own personal security? Are they worried about whether or not they're going to have those resources? Those are the things that are going to influence what level of communication I'm going to provide and what level of knowledge and how quickly I'm going to provide that to them in all of those different respects. So we need to be able to practice empathy and walk that mile to say, this is the critical information that I'm hearing from my people, from listening, but also the things that I want to make sure that they're aware of so they know that this process is being handled as best as possible. One of the most important things is extending yourself grace and extending the people around you grace. In those moments of panic, we behave sometimes very poorly. And we have to recognize that sometimes transference comes in. Somebody gets stressed and they get upset with us, even though it has nothing to do with what we did. It's them relaying their own internal struggle or stress upon us. We have to be able to extend that person grace in a time of crisis. Number one, we don't have the resources internally to swallow all of that up and take it personally. But at the same time, what we're doing is trying to diffuse that and de-escalate that type of situation. We also have to be willing to extend ourselves some grace. we're going to have to be making decisions quickly or adapting. We're going to have to be communicating, and mistakes are going to be made. Dwelling on them can put us into that downward spiral, which makes it even harder for us to function as a leader. So that's somewhere where we absolutely want to think about extending that grace externally and leading by example, because then in return, what ultimately ends up happening is people often will extend that grace back to us. So these are some things that you need to think about from the leadership perspective, particularly understanding the way that people behave inside of it. They're going to process information differently. They're going to behave differently. They're going to look for those panic moments, and they're going to look to their leader to say, I've got this under control. I'm managing this. This is something that we are doing. Here's how we're looking at it. But also to make sure that you're understanding very, very clearly the emotional state and the mental state of the people that are around us. Through those processes and through those practices, we as leaders can look outwards, even beyond the crisis, to say, what happens when this comes to a conclusion? Because eventually, ideally, that crisis comes to a conclusion. We want to be prepared for the best possible outcomes that occur afterwards. So making sure that we have this nice plan, that we look through all of these different things, that we're making decision calculuses in the moments where we have the most amount of strength and the most amount of capacity, will help us to get through those day-to-day things. Being agile and being kind to each other and to ourselves is something that we can use from our leadership arsenal in order to make the best possible influences and give people the most amount of uncertainty reduction, helping them to manage the crisis personally. Thank you so much for your time today. I really hope that you enjoyed this and are able to take some of these steps and incorporate them now and in the future, because crisis is cyclical. We'll see another crisis, whether that's an internal organizational or whether that's something that is this scale, but making sure that we have these things in play will hopefully give you the best chance at emerging successful. Thank you so much for being with me, and thank you so much to JCI Finland for putting this amazing program on. Wishing you all safe and healthy next couple of weeks. Wishing you the best. Thanks.